Everybody knows about the iPod. And look, if you're old enough to be watching this video, you probably owned an iPod too. I know that I did. So get subscribed and leave a comment down below on which iPod you got. Now, we think of Apple today as a monolithic success, one of the world's richest companies. But it wasn't always like this. In 1998, Apple was near bankruptcy. And in the year 2000, the company reported its greatest quarterly loss in nearly a decade. Just 9 months later, weeks after the September 11th attacks on New York City, and amidst a weird anthrax scare, the world was not in a great place. Steve Jobs gets up on stage and announces iPod to a very small group of journalists in an eerily somber release. Now look, the iPod was not the first MP3 player, not even close. And it was only compatible with the Mac, a small user base of just 7 million people and shrinking. With its 5 gig hard drive, it boasted the 1,000 songs in your pocket slogan for $399, which was not a great deal compared to the competition, which were both less money and compatible with Windows, the operating system literally everyone used. But Apple did as Apple does, and love them or hate them, the product was well built, it had excellent battery life, it had quick transfer speeds thanks to its FireWire connection, it had better skip protection, which was awesome when you were running and working out, and just a bunch of small quality of life improvements that, while by themselves not too substantial, added up to make something that mattered, something that was better. Well, one thing led to another, and iPod became a smashing success, mostly thanks to the release of the iTunes Music Store, Windows compatibility, as well as the release of smaller, less expensive devices like iPod Mini and iPod Nano. Let me put this into perspective for you. From 2001 to 2005, Apple sells 41 million iPods. That's nothing to scoff at, that's a lot. But in the year 2006 alone, Apple sold nearly that same amount as the first 5 years, 39 million. By end of year 2006, Apple owned more than 3/4 of the MP3 player hardware market. And the iTunes Music Store, and this is the important part, was responsible for over 80% of all legal music downloads. Now, why is this important, you ask? Well, all of this music was copy protected at the request of record labels that didn't want you sharing your music you've purchased with friends and people online. And guess what music player it is copy protected to? The only one it can be synced with, the iPod. So you buy music on iTunes and you have to own an iPod. This quickly meant that the high-end portable music player market was on lockdown. And most MP3 player manufacturers like SanDisk and Creative attempted to tackle the low end, offering a better user interface and playback experience than Apple's really low-end products like the similarly priced iPod Shuffle. Long story short, nobody was foolish enough to believe that they could dethrone the iPod because it was king. At least nobody other than the least cool company on the planet in the mid-2000s, who in November of 2006 announced this, the Microsoft Zune. Oh boy. Now, to credit Microsoft with the Zune entirely is a bit disingenuous because it's basically a rebranded Toshiba player. The operating system that this portable music player runs was created by Toshiba and just skinned by Microsoft. And the hardware itself was manufactured by Toshiba. It's just that Microsoft lent them a little bit of design cues. I'm not sure that this looks much better than what Toshiba had made on their own, however, because while it did have this cool double-shot plastic design where you had a base color and then a translucent color on the top, they went with colors like brown and green. Now, look, I'm a bit of a fanboy of the brown and green color, I'll be honest, but most people consider this one of the ugliest tech products that have ever been made. But do you know what? I'll fight all of you guys because I think it's actually a legitimately really premium looking device. But the hardware didn't really matter to Microsoft. They were a software company. And so the Zune launched alongside Zune Marketplace for Windows. And it was basically iTunes, but worse in every way. Except for one thing, and that was Zune Pass, which was $15 a month, $14.99, and it was a streaming service. If you go back in time, I mean, you look at something like the iPod and these music players that you sync with your computer, they are designed to play music. We scroll through them, we have our albums, you can click to them, you play them. The idea of music ownership was cool. It's a personal jukebox. This is my music, I own it. Nobody liked the idea of a subscription streaming service, and a lot of people made fun of Microsoft for releasing it, but holy crap, they were right. I mean, look, all of us use streaming services today, and it's a shame that Microsoft was just a little bit too early. You might think, oh, $15 a month is a little steep, but what they did was cool. They allowed you to keep 10 songs at the end of the month to own. They were yours, even if you stopped paying for Zune Pass. So really, the subscription service was only $5 a month. The problem was the hardware. This thing, while okay, was expected to compete with the 5th generation iPod video. And as you can tell, it was just bulkier, it had much worse battery life, it had terrible menu navigation, mostly because there's no click wheel. The click wheel on the iPod was awesome, and this just, you had to click individually or scroll, wasn't good. It did have a few redeeming features, like an FM radio, but at the end of the day, really, who cares about that? And one special feature that had a name that I'm just gonna have to say, squirting. In short, you could squirt things to your friends. Music, pictures, videos. If your other friend had a Zune, which no one did, but in theory, if you had a friend who also owned a Zune, you could squirt on each other the music and videos and photos that you had stored on your devices. Now, photos and videos could be squirted without any restrictions whatsoever. Music, you could only squirt to a couple of friends, and then that friend would receive your song. I guess, how do you receive would be squirted upon a song, and they could play it back 3 times in 3 days. What was cool about it, though, is that when they plugged their Zune back into their computer, the Zune music store would say, hey, your friend squirted a song to you and you seem to like it. Would you like to either A, purchase the song, or B, add it to your subscription Zune Music Pass? This was a really cool idea, and if Apple had done the same thing, it would have been a smashing success. I just don't think they would have called it squirting, and I'm honestly not sure why Microsoft did either. Anyway, the first Zune launched to lukewarm reception, and most companies would have probably given up on it, but not Microsoft. Well, luckily, the Zune actually really did flourish into its own come the 2nd generation of devices. There were 3 models, Zune 4 and Zune 8, which had 4 gigabytes and 8 gigabytes of flash storage, respectively, that targeted squarely in its sights Apple's successful iPod Nano. And then they also released a Zune 80, which was a hard drive-based competitor meant to compete with the iPod Classic. The Zune Flash, as it became known because, well, flash storage, was notoriously unreliable, and eBay is littered with a bunch of broken models. Mine is also broken, indicating a dead battery. So let's see if we can fix it. It is pretty small, isn't it? So I've been troubleshooting this thing about 15 minutes, and we are not going to get this up and running. Let me explain why. Every lithium-ion battery has what's called a PCM, or power control module. It basically just does load balancing and voltage regulation. Just make sure that your lithium-ion batteries stay happy, and basically every lithium-ion battery has one, including the Zune. I purchased an aftermarket battery on eBay that only had 2 stars, like I mentioned. The reason for it having 2 stars is that it's seemingly only compatible with the first revision of Zune Flash. There were 2 revisions, because initially there was Zune 4 and Zune 8, and then Microsoft discontinued Zune 4 and made Zune 8 and Zune 16. When they did that, they changed the revision of Zune 8 into a completely new design, and in so doing, created incompatibility between this PCM on the aftermarket battery and the original batteries, and the 2nd revision Zunes. 2nd revision Zune Flash did not sell well at all, and there's basically no aftermarket batteries, and so I was dead in the water. I thought, oh, I'm not an idiot. Maybe I can unsolder the PCM from the original battery and then solder it to the new battery. And that was a good idea. I've done it before, except for one little issue. The original battery leaked and corroded all over this original PCB, and so it's just caked in crap. And unfortunately, I couldn't unsolder these rear connections without pulling the pads off. It was just crappy design, and so really, there's 2 things to learn here. 1, don't solder stuff down that doesn't need to be soldered, and then 2, if you buy something old and used on eBay that wasn't very popular, good luck getting replacement parts. The 2nd generation of Zune carried over the few unique features that the first Zune had, namely the FM radio and the squirt function. Luckily, the 2nd generation devices were designed by Microsoft, and so they did improve on a number of things. Most importantly, navigation, which we already established was terrible on the first Zune. But what was instituted in the 2nd gen was called the Zune Pad. I already talked about how great the click wheel was for the iPod, and I think this is actually, in some instances, a much better navigation alternative. Because with the click wheel, you would spin, and sometimes you'd go 1 click too far or 2 clicks back, and you could adjust the sensitivity, but it was never that great. What's cool about the Zune is it uses inertial scrolling, which really became popular on modern phones later. And so you could scroll up and down with this touchpad, but you could also click to move up and down manually. This was great if you needed to move 1 or 2 spots quickly without wanting to deal with touch-sensitive scrolling. It ended up being a really, really great feature. One other small quality of life improvement that they brought was glass screens. That's an improvement from the first generation Zune's plastic screen. Unfortunately, the 6th generation iPod Classic and 3rd generation iPod Nano, which hit market 6 months before these two things did, carried those features as well. Bit of a bummer. This device as well, the Zune Flash, instituted landscape video, which was pretty cool. But the iPod Nano also had landscape video, and the iPod Nano 3rd generation's display was actually a little bit bigger than this one. We have a problem again, right? Well, there is one area in which this was a saving grace, and that was fidelity. The DAC in this thing is fantastic. That's digital to analog converter. And then the headphone amplifier. The iPod always sounded okay, but this Zune sounded amazing. And even all these years later, I can plug a pair of headphones in, listen to a modern album, and it sounds better than most smartphones and even laptops available today. It's truly amazing what these Zunes did. Unfortunately, the Zune just had a history of truancy and being a little bit too far behind. And the 2nd generation Zune didn't fix that. Microsoft was just too late to hit the market, and every device they released mimicked the features found on competing iPods 6 months to a year prior. To make matters worse, Microsoft could have beat Apple in one category, but they didn't, and that's price. Zune was always priced the same as the competing iPods, and in some circumstances, like the 2nd generation Zunes, the Zune was actually 99 cents more expensive than its contender. Which brings us to the last Zune. The best Zune of all, and the Zune that I wish could have really made it. The Zune HD. And this thing is freaking awesome. And it seems that Twitter agrees with me when I say that. Now, you might be wondering, Zune HD, what does the HD stand for? Well, get out of here. You might be wondering, well, what does that stand for? Certainly it's not an HD display. This is 2009, and you'd be correct. It had a display resolution of 480 by 272 pixels. That's not HD. So what was HD? Well, that was the HD FM tuner found inside of the device. Apparently the FM tuner was actually a very popular feature of the Zunes. And in the United States, HD radio stations kind of came into play in the mid to late 2000s, and this device supported them. And I gotta say, they actually sound really pretty good. But where this thing did excel was the display, even though it's not technically HD. Why is that? Well, this display has a trick up its sleeve, and that is OLED technology. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, this is an OLED display from 2009. I saw my first OLED display in 2011, 2 years after this came out. And do you know what it was? It was on a frickin' Zune HD. This thing was one of the earliest OLEDs in any consumer devices. And it still sounds and looks, it went back to the tuner. It still sounds and looks fantastic all these years later. And that's helped by the Metro UI design. It's this fantastic menu that is very minimalist and flat in design. You could click a letter and go to the album artist. You could click the album to play it. You have a song listing. You press play. It had these beautiful animations. Text is rich white. The background is dark black. It really did look excellent. And if you compare this design to something like, I don't know, the iPod Touch or the iPhone of the era running iOS 3 that was skeuomorphic as all get out, this thing looked like the future. You go back and you look at something like the iPod or the iPhone today, and it looks dated. It looks bad. The Zune HD does not, even though it is an 11-year-old user interface. Everything is intentional. Everything is precise. And I think that while we see basically everyone converting to a flat design, many of whom doing so because it's a trend, I'm looking at you, BMW, and not doing a very good job at it, I think the Zune HD's interface will look good for decades to come because it was one of the first and it was intentional. It had a purpose. And oh my goodness, it is so good. But the user interface is not really why you buy a music player. Though I might say that the Zune HD ended up being a better music player than the iPod Touch could have ever hoped of being, because of the user interface, because of the art-rich selection, because of the navigation features and the syncing capabilities. You could sync this thing over Wi-Fi with your computer, a feature that didn't make it into the iPhone and the iPod Touch for another 3 years. It also, as all the other Zunes, had onboard Wi-Fi, but what this onboard Wi-Fi allowed you to do was access the marketplace to download and sync songs that you either purchased or leasing or renting through your Zune Pass, as well as apps and games. This thing was just really great. It was thinner and smaller than the iPod Touch. The fidelity was fantastic. This is one of the highest resolution players to ever hit the mainstream market. And still listening to an album through the headphone jack, headphone jack, it used to be this hole that was on every device and you could just plug whatever headphones you wanted into it and it just worked. It was open source and free and really awesome. Yeah, the headphone jack sounded fantastic on this thing. And even still, I don't think most smartphones, including the iPhone 11, sounds as good as the Zune HD. Crazy as that seems. It had better battery life than the iPod Touch. It was smaller, it was thinner, and it had a more powerful NVIDIA Tegra SoC. So why did this thing fail? By every measure, it should have succeeded. To make matters even worse, Microsoft did launch this at $20 less than the competing iPod Touch models. And after just 3 months on the market, lowered prices yet again another $30, making this a $50 price cut, which was substantial for devices of this price tag. Remember when gadgets didn't cost $1,000? $50 was a lot. Now, sounds like a comparatively good device, but it failed for a couple of reasons. For one, Microsoft completely screwed the pooch on the apps front. More than a music player, iPod Touch was an apps machine. And whilst Microsoft did provide an XNA development platform for Zune, this was a music player first and an apps machine second. Development tools provided by Microsoft were limited compared to Apple's. Furthermore, Apple's iPhone and iPod Touch shared the same operating system and were cross-compatible, which was important for such a booming application market. As if that wasn't enough, Microsoft's XNA development tools didn't permit full access to the Zune HD's hardware. I'm expecting to save battery, but internet access was prohibited, 3D processing was limited, and performance was nerfed. The end result was that Microsoft's native Zune apps worked great and everyone else's sucked. Developers got sick of it and just abandoned the platform once it didn't reach mass adoption. Since then, an open source team at ZuneBoards has developed OpenZDK, an open source development platform by which you could develop for Zune, doing what Microsoft seemingly couldn't, and unlocking the hardware to run a flurry of fan-made apps, like a Doom port, NES and Game Boy emulators, remote desktop software for Windows, chat clients, 3D games, and more. But most notably, even though that was cool, the Zune was just too late. Zune HD launched in November of 2009, more than 2 years after the release of iPod Touch, and 2 weeks after the iPod Touch's third generation device had hit the market. More than a year and a half after Apple's App Store launched on iPhone OS 2. There was no hope for the Zune. Apple's mobile platform was healthy, had tons of apps, good developer tools, and a market. Zune was not a bad device, especially not Zune HD, but it failed because Microsoft was seemingly incapable of doing anything right at the time. Ever heard of Windows Vista? The hardware lagged behind due to poor timing, insufficient innovation, and the marketing trying to outcool what was the trendiest gadget on the planet from an Apple that everyone wanted to have in their pocket. Microsoft had simply lost the race before they had ever begun and lost billions of dollars in the process. If you're interested in hearing more about the Zune, I talked about it on my podcast Flashback with my co-host Stephen Hackett of Relay FM. Check it out by searching Flashback in any podcast app of your choice, or check the link in the video description below. Well, folks, that's all for me. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you didn't, well, that other button seems to work okay too. Get subscribed for more awesome tech videos like this one. Leave your thoughts and comments down below on the Zune. Most importantly, and as always, stay snazzy. See you later, folks.